My name is Sari van Pooijen. I'm the director of Intact Academy and Team Agility. Within Intact Academy, we train coaches and consultants from beginning coach to team coach to supervisor of coaches. And within Team Agility, we help businesses, small startups, family businesses, large businesses, to innovate more quickly than their products. Within startups, that means we help them to scale. Within large businesses, that means we help them to innovate their processes, their leadership style, their cooperative style. So one of the things that is preoccupying me at the moment is the difference I see in how countries react to COVID. And I'm seeing because I've worked all over the world, I see these differences very clearly. For fun, I was comparing my agenda from last year, May, to this year, May. Last year, May, I was in 10 different countries in 4 weeks, and that used to define my life. At the moment, I'm not traveling, which is an interesting thing because I'm traveling in my head and through the camera with people in other countries. But cultural scripting and cultures have been a fascination of mine for a very long time, because I think that apart from your personal life story, you also have a cultural life story. And that actually co-determines how we react to COVID. So what is a cultural script? Well, within transactional analysis, we talk about cultural script in 2 ways. One, at the individual level, you've integrated the etiquette techniques and character of a certain culture. So that means etiquette are the values and the rules of your tribe. The techniques are the methods you create success. The character are the degrees of freedom you have in a culture to be yourself or have to adapt. So, for instance, in the army, the etiquette is very strong. The techniques are pre-subscribed in standard operating procedures. And the character is very narrow because the room to be yourself within the army is smaller than the force to adapt. At the social level, a cultural script are the accepted and expected dramatic patterns of events based on unspoken assumptions by the majority. So this is a definition by James and Jongewaard. And I really like that definition because it has to do with patterns and unspoken assumptions. And it also stresses the fact that the majority actually determines what happens in a culture. So we can talk about that later, how you can become the resistance. But at the moment, I'm really focusing on what does this mean for our reactions to COVID? Now, usually a cultural script becomes latent until there is a new unknown situation, and specifically if the resources become scarce. And also if you're suddenly addressed as a representative of your group instead of as a person. So for instance, COVID-19 is a completely unexpected situation for all of us. And certainly, suddenly all our unspoken assumptions come up about who belongs to our group or not. So you see suddenly, for instance, that the boundaries are closed, the frontiers are closed, and suddenly we're focusing only on our national well-being, and the whole European thinking has gone out the window suddenly, which is interesting, what happens under stress. Cultural scripts also become very apparent the moment there are scarce resources. So think of this, you're in a country, there is a lack of food, and people start to go to supermarkets and buy toilet rolls, only for their own family. And the government even stresses, you're only allowed to touch within your family unit, and people become really creative about what their family unit is. I know my niece is in a student home, and everyone in that student home has suddenly become a family unit, and they only share their resources within that home. So what COVID had also done is it's created a fear about scarce resources, And it has forced us to think about who is part of our clan and who isn't. It's very primitive thinking. In times of well-being and lots of wealth, we usually don't think of that because there's enough to go around within the majority, I have to stress. But in times of COVID or pandemic or other crisis, you suddenly see that scarce resources bring up the cultural scripting, which is very primitive. Are you part of my clan or not? And the third reason that cultural script comes up is when you're addressed as a member of your group. So, for instance, within business, I was often the youngest and the only female at that level in a company. And I was usually very surprised to be suddenly addressed as, what do you think women think of this? And I was going, oh, yes, because I wasn't there specifically as a woman. I was there as the global lead of HR. Of course, I'm very happy to be a woman and to represent that. And I do a lot for that as well. But to be suddenly addressed as a representative of your group means that your cultural scripting comes up, good or bad, whatever you learned around that. So in this, I want to be clear that during times of pandemic, what happens is that your internal representation of your culture and the external representation of culture comes up again because it's new, unknown, there are scarce resources, and you're addressed as a representative of your group. Within the COVID situation, of course, we had both new, there were scarce resources, though not the resources that people thought. I think there were other scarce resources. And we were addressed as representatives of a group. We were suddenly diminished to being an element in a family unit. And we were forced to determine who our family was. What this did in our society is that suddenly cultural scripting became not latent, but very pertinent and very obvious to all of us. And what happened is that you see countries within that cultural script relive old paradigms of culture and really create measures that fit with those old paradigms. I'm talking, for instance, about some cultures in which a military paradigm suddenly became apparent again, even countries that were on the way to democracy, countries that I've lived in, for instance, Hungary, countries like Serbia, where I have clients, and then we have countries like Holland, where I'm living at the moment, where you see a resurgence of a thinking in terms of we. And maybe that's the dimension. One of the dimensions of the resurgence of cultural scripting is, where are you on that dimension between I and we? And we'll talk about that later.